Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the oddly familiar world of medieval junk food. Picture yourself standing in a bustling medieval market, surrounded by the chatter of vendors and the deliciously questionable smells of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and beer that's just a little too warm. But don't get too comfortable. Let's face it, you probably wouldn't survive a day in this culinary scene without a solid stomach and a tolerance for grease. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Makes this whole bedtime journey feel even more like we're sharing the adventure together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably never thought about medieval junk food, but it was as much a part of life back then as it is today, minus the processed sugars and preservatives. Medieval people had their own version of fast food, and while it might not have looked like our modern greasy drive-through snacks, it was just as satisfying. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval city or town. The hustle and bustle is everywhere. Merchants haggling over the price of wool, farmers selling their produce, and in the midst of it all, food stalls. These weren't the trendy food trucks you see in the modern world. They were more like informal roadside snack bars that provided the medieval equivalent of comfort food. Now, you're probably thinking, what on earth could medieval junk food be? Well, it wasn't the sleek, packaged treats we think of today, but it sure was delicious and easy to grab. Picture simple meats, cheesy pastries, bread slathered in butter, and the ever-popular ale to wash it all down. Medieval junk food was fast, accessible, and satisfying, but not without its quirks. Sure, there wasn't a golden arch in sight, but there were plenty of vendors with hearty snacks to keep you going during the long, hard days. Now that you've got a picture of what medieval junk food might look like, let's take a stroll down the streets of a medieval city and check out the vibrant food stalls where all this fast food came to life. The air is thick with the scent of sizzling meat, the earthy aroma of fresh-baked bread, and the faintly sweet waft of fruits being sold in small wooden baskets. In a way, these street vendors were the medieval version of modern-day food trucks, minus the shiny chrome and Instagram-worthy aesthetics. At every corner, there's someone peddling something to nibble on, whether it's a meat-filled pastry, a hunk of cheese, or a roasted fish on a stick. Street food was cheap, easy to grab, and perfect for people who didn't have the time or resources to prepare a full meal at home. But these weren't just any random snacks. They were deeply tied to the social and economic structure of medieval life. Let's start with the basics. Bread. For many medieval people, bread was the go-to snack. It was cheap, easy to make, and could be topped with a variety of ingredients. Bread, especially the crusty, rustic loaves that were common in the Middle Ages, was often sold by the piece. Vendors would slice off a hunk and slather it with butter, cheese, or lard, creating a simple yet satisfying meal for someone on the go. Remember, these weren't fancy baguettes or artisan loaves. This was bread that was dense, filling, and made with whatever grain was available. The rich might enjoy it with a bit of spiced honey or jam. But for the average person, a slice of bread with a dollop of butter was a treat in itself. Historians still argue whether bread was more of a luxury for the poor, or if it truly was an essential part of their daily diet. Some scholars suggest that the poor ate much more bread because it was filling and cheap, while others believe it was more of an occasional indulgence. Either way, it was certainly the go-to junk food of its time. and people didn't mind grabbing a quick slice while they went about their day. You might think of it as the medieval equivalent of grabbing a quick snack from a corner deli, except with far fewer options. And then there were the savory pastries and meat pies. You couldn't walk through a medieval market without seeing these flaky, golden delights piled high on wooden trays. These pastries, stuffed with all sorts of savory fillings, meat, cheese, and vegetables, were the ultimate street food for those looking for something more substantial. Imagine sinking your teeth into a warm, freshly baked pie with a rich filling, the buttery crust crumbling with each bite. It was the medieval equivalent of grabbing a fast food sandwich, only you'd wash it down with a tankard of ale instead of a soda. In fact, medieval street food and snacks were often paired with a good drink, whether it was ale, mead, or wine, depending on your social status. These drinks were the perfect accompaniment to a hearty pastry or slice of bread. The fact that alcohol was often safer to drink than water made it a popular choice, and it became an essential part of the medieval snack scene. You'd wander the streets, nibbling on your meat pie, sipping your drink, and chatting with friends or passing strangers. It wasn't just about filling your belly. It was about the experience, the social element that food always brings. So, we've talked about the simple but satisfying staples of medieval street food, bread and pastries. But let's not forget about the true fast food of the medieval period, meat pies and roasted meats on sticks. Yes, you heard that right, roasted meats. Medieval street vendors were masters at turning cuts of meat into quick and portable meals, which could be eaten while walking or chatting with friends. Imagine a vendor calling out to passers-by, offering hot, charred meat on skewers or in a flaky pastry shell, whether it was beef, mutton, or even more exotic meats like venison. This was the fast food of the Middle Ages, satisfying the appetite of everyone from peasants to nobles. If you were walking down a medieval street, you'd see vendors roasting large chunks of meat over an open flame, often suspended on a spit or roasted in a makeshift grill. The aroma of sizzling meat would fill the air, drawing people in from all directions. There was no need for fancy condiments, just the natural smokiness of the meat, with perhaps a sprinkle of salt and herbs to enhance the flavor. For the average person, this was a cheap, hearty meal that didn't require any preparation at home. For the rich, roasted meats were more than just food. They were a sign of wealth and luxury. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy people to enjoy lavish feasts with whole roasted animals. But for the poor, a roasted chunk of meat on a stick was as good as it got. Historians still argue about how much meat the average medieval person ate. Some believe that the poor had very little access to meat, relying mostly on bread, vegetables, and dairy, while others argue that meat was more common in their diets than we think, especially in rural areas where hunting was more prevalent. Either way, meat was seen as a delicacy, and having access to roasted meats on the street was a treat for most. You might not have had the money for a full roast, but you could certainly snag a quick, savory bite to keep you going through your busy day. A quirky tidbit: medieval meat pies weren't just about the meat. Often, they contained other ingredients like vegetables, spices, and even dried fruit. This blend of savory and sweet was a common feature in medieval cooking, and it made meat pies a unique form of comfort food. Think of it as a medieval fusion dish, savory meat combined with the unexpected sweetness of fruit, all wrapped in a buttery, flaky crust. It wasn't just about filling the belly. It was about creating a satisfying, rich, and complex flavor profile that made medieval street food stand out. In fact, meat pies were often eaten during celebrations, festivals, or feasts, especially for those who had access to more elaborate foods. They were also one of the first forms of food that could be prepared in advance, making them the perfect option for busy market stalls. The ability to grab a warm, hearty pie filled with meat or vegetables and eat it on the go was one of the conveniences of medieval life. After all, who had time to sit down for a formal meal when you were busy with work or socializing? Now, let's move on to the other beloved medieval snack that was a staple of both street food and the typical diet. Cheese. Yes, cheese in medieval times. It wasn't just the bread that took center stage at market stalls, but a wide variety of cheeses, each with its own distinct character and flavor. For medieval people, cheese was the perfect on-the-go snack. It was easy to carry, filled with energy, and could be paired with virtually anything. Whether it was the humble farmer with a hunk of cheese wrapped in cloth, or the noble enjoying a delicacy at the banquet table, cheese was integral to the medieval food experience. Walking through a medieval marketplace, you would encounter tables piled high with wheels of cheese, some aged, some fresh, and all with a unique texture and flavor. Cheddar, brie, or something far more exotic, depending on where you were. Medieval cheese was made using simple methods passed down through generations. Farmers and cheesemakers used milk from cows, goats, and sheep to craft cheeses that would last for months and even years. This wasn't the pre-packaged, plastic-wrapped cheese you might grab at the store. Medieval cheese was often round or square, wrapped in cloth or stored in wooden boxes. It was the kind of cheese you could cut, slice, or break off in chunks, making it perfect for snacking on the go. Cheese wasn't just a treat for the upper class, either. The rich might enjoy a fine brie or an exotic cheese made from goat's milk. But the common folk made do with simpler varieties. Cheese was a form of sustenance, not just luxury. It was affordable, nutritious, and kept for a long time. In fact, medieval cheese was often stored in cool, dry places, and as it aged, it became harder and more pungent. A characteristic that only added to its charm, or perhaps its bite, depending on your perspective. Historians still debate whether cheese was considered a luxury or a staple for the poor in medieval times. Some argue that wealthier families had access to better quality cheese, while others believe cheese was universally consumed across all classes. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Everyone ate cheese, but the varieties and qualities might have varied depending on social status. For the wealthy, cheese was an indulgence, often enjoyed with wine or other luxurious food. For the poor, it was a filling and practical food that could be eaten with bread or vegetables, and its ability to keep well made it an essential item for long winters. But here's the quirky part. Medieval cheeses didn't always taste like what we have today. They were often more potent, sometimes with a stronger tangier flavor, partially due to the way they were aged. This wasn't the mild cheese you might throw on a sandwich. Medieval cheese had bite, and in some cases, it was even used as a form of currency. In certain areas, cheese was so valuable that it was traded as a commodity in and of itself. Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about some of the more unusual and surprising junk food options medieval people indulged in, while meat pies and cheeses were staple street foods. Medieval snacks could get a little experimental. Imagine yourself walking down a bustling medieval street, the smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling meat wafting through the air. when your gaze is drawn to a vendor selling something you'd never expect, roasted fish. Not just any fish. These were oily, greasy fish, roasted and salted for street-side consumption. Fish wasn't just for the rich or those living near rivers and seas. It was a staple for many medieval people, especially since fish was cheaper and more readily available than meat in some areas. Vendors would roast fish over an open flame, perhaps adding herbs or salt for flavor, and then hand you the oily, salty treat on a skewer. It wasn't the delicate, boneless fillets we might enjoy today. No. Medieval fish was hearty, often served with bones, skin, and all, which added to the rustic charm, or perhaps the challenge, of eating it. Whether it was herring, cod, or sardines, fish was an easily portable snack, full of nutrients and perfect for eating on the go. It wasn't the cleanest, most refined meal, but it was quick and satisfying. Historians still argue whether fish was considered a luxury or a common food item. In some places, fish was a premium product, especially salt-cured or dried fish, which could be stored for long periods and was particularly popular in medieval coastal areas. On the other hand, it was also cheap and accessible for poorer communities, especially during Lent, when meat consumption was restricted by religious practices, and fish was seen as a suitable alternative. Medieval people weren't shy about eating fish in all its forms, whether fresh, salted, or smoked, and they used it in a variety of ways, sometimes on its own, other times incorporated into pies or stews. Now, let's talk about something that might raise a few eyebrows: fried or roasted insects. Yes, in the medieval world, if you were really hungry and desperate, or just a fan of extreme flavors, you might find yourself snacking on locusts, grasshoppers, or even beetles. They weren't as common in the everyday diet as bread or meat. But in times of famine or food scarcity, insects were a cheap and surprisingly nutritious option. In fact, fried or roasted insects were sometimes included in medieval cookbooks. And while they may seem like an oddity now, they were considered a delicacy in some regions of Europe. A quirky tidbit: medieval people were not as squeamish as we are today. Insects, along with other odd snacks like blood sausage, were part of their culinary culture, and they even had a practical reason for eating them. During harsh winters or periods of famine, when food was in short supply, anything that could provide nutrition was welcomed. Fried insects were rich in protein, and as odd as it may sound, they were considered a valuable source of sustenance when other foods were unavailable. And don't even get me started on how medieval people used sweeteners. They didn't have sugar in the same way we do today, but they had honey, and plenty of it. Honey was used not just for sweetening, but also as a preservative for fruits, nuts, and even candies. Imagine medieval honey cakes or honeyed fruits, which were often enjoyed at feasts or as a treat after a long day of work. While modern candy bars were still centuries away, medieval sweets often involved honey, dried fruits, and nuts. But unlike the overly sweet treats of today, these medieval snacks were much more subtle in flavor, relying on natural sweetness rather than processed sugars. Let's take a deeper dive into medieval snacks and talk about the drink that kept everyone going: ale and mead. While today, a soft drink or coffee might be your go-to companion for snacking, medieval folk had their own, much stronger choices. Beer, ale, and mead were the drinks of choice for nearly everyone, rich or poor. If you were on the go, whether at a market stall or in the comfort of your home, these drinks often accompanied medieval junk food, providing the perfect pairing for that hearty meat pie or cheese-laden bread. Medieval ale wasn't like the craft brews you see in your local bar. It was often a cloudy, rough concoction, brewed from barley, wheat, or oats, and it wasn't always alcoholic by today's standards. Many medieval ales were low in alcohol, often referred to as small beer or small ale. This was a drink you could consume throughout the day, and it was considered safer than drinking water, which, at the time, could be contaminated. But while small beer was the everyday drink, it was still a form of junk food in its own right. Cheap, easy to drink, and providing a little bit of energy to keep you going during the day. Vendors at the markets would often have large barrels of this small ale available for sale, served in wooden cups or mugs, ready to wash down a quick snack. The wealthier classes didn't settle for small beer, though. No, for those with money. There was mead, made from honey, water, and sometimes fruits or herbs. Mead was a stronger, sweeter alternative to ale. It was the drink of kings and nobles, and it was often served at feasts or special occasions. The rich also had access to more refined wines. But mead remained a popular choice for social events, particularly in regions where honey was abundant. Historians still debate how much mead was consumed by the average person. Some argue it was mainly a luxury item for the upper classes, while others suggest that it was enjoyed by commoners as well, though perhaps less frequently. But what makes these medieval drinks particularly fascinating is how they fit into the concept of junk food. In many ways, medieval ale, beer, and mead acted as liquid snacks, consumed throughout the day and at all hours, just like modern soft drinks or energy drinks. While today's caffeine-heavy beverages might keep you awake during a late-night study session, medieval drinks like ale would keep you hydrated, happy, and ready for the next round of hearty eating. And let's not forget the social element of drinking. Whether you were sipping ale in a bustling tavern or sharing a mug of mead with friends, these drinks were always part of a social gathering. In a sense, medieval snacks weren't just about the food, they were about the community and the shared experience of eating and drinking together. A quirky detail to note is that medieval ale wasn't always brewed by professionals. In fact, it was often brewed at home by women, known as alewives, who were responsible for the brewing and selling of ale. They would often sell their homemade concoctions from stalls or in their homes, turning ale brewing into a sort of side hustle or primary livelihood long before we had microbreweries. This tradition of alewives brewing and selling their ale was so well established that some medieval towns even had laws governing the sale of ale, ensuring that it was of decent quality and not overly strong, lest it lead to too much revelry. So, while we think of junk food today as something unhealthy and processed, medieval people had their own version, just with a little more buzz. You can almost imagine grabbing a quick cup of ale with a piece of bread or a hot meat pie while strolling through the medieval market, chatting with neighbors and feeling the community around you. It wasn't gourmet, but it sure hit the spot. As we continue down the road of medieval junk food, let's take a look at the sweet side of things. If you think that sugary snacks are a modern invention, think again. Medieval people had their own ways of indulging their sweet tooth. While they didn't have candy bars or cupcakes, they still knew how to satisfy their cravings with fruits, honey, and a few surprisingly sweet concoctions. However, there was one catch. Medieval sweets weren't as sugar-packed as the treats we know today. Instead, they relied on natural sugars from honey, fruits, and occasionally the spices that could add a little extra sweetness to their snacks. Let's start with honey, the medieval sweetener of choice. Honey was a precious commodity in the medieval period. It wasn't just a sweetener, It was used in everything from cooking to medicine. Medieval people would drizzle honey on bread or dip fruits into it to create a quick, satisfying snack. It was also used to make mead, which was a favorite drink among the wealthy and common folk alike. But honey was also found in medieval sweets, like honey cakes. These cakes were often simple, made with a basic dough and then sweetened with honey, and occasionally flavored with spices like cinnamon or nutmeg. Imagine biting into a warm, slightly crumbly honey cake, the sweetness filling your mouth. It wasn't the same as a modern cupcake, but it was the medieval equivalent of a quick, sweet treat. Historians still debate how common these honey-based treats were. Some believe honey was reserved for the upper classes, who could afford the luxury of importing it or keeping bees for production. Others argue that honey was more accessible to the common folk, who would have used it as both a sweetener and a preservative. Either way, it was one of the most important sweeteners available, and its role in medieval junk food can't be understated. Fruits were another key part of medieval sweets. While they didn't have the kind of fruit orchards we're familiar with today, medieval people still enjoyed fruits like apples, pears, plums, and berries when they were in season. These fruits were eaten fresh or preserved for later use, often in the form of jams or dried fruit. Sometimes fruits would be paired with honey, creating a simple yet satisfying snack. Medieval festivals, which were prime opportunities for indulgence, often featured fruit-based sweets that would have been a treat for everyone, from peasants to nobles. Imagine a stall at a medieval fair, laden with skewered fruits dipped in honey, or dried fruit bundled into small cakes. While it might not have been as flashy as modern candy, these fruit treats would have been an exciting sweet option in a world without chocolate. But medieval sweets didn't stop there. Let's not forget about spice cakes and puddings, which had their own unique twist. These cakes weren't the fluffy, sugar-laden versions we know today. Instead, they were dense and spiced with things like cloves, ginger, and cinnamon, sweet but also savory. Puddings, too, were made with grains like rice or barley, sweetened with honey or dried fruits, and sometimes flavored with spices or rose water. These medieval desserts were filling, hearty, and a far cry from today's airy sponge cakes or light jellies. What's fascinating is how these medieval sweets were also tied to the social structure of the time. For the wealthy, sweets like sugar-glazed pastries, spiced cakes, and fruit preserves were seen as indulgences, often served at feasts and gatherings. For the poor, however, sweets were more about practical use. Honey served as a sweetener for their daily bread, and dried fruits or simple cakes were affordable snacks that could feed a family. Still, medieval people knew how to make do with what they had, and their ability to create sweet treats out of the ingredients available to them speaks to their resourcefulness. Historians still argue whether medieval sweets were more about function or indulgence. Some believe these treats were primarily utilitarian, used to provide energy and comfort in a harsh world. Others suggest that medieval people had a deeper appreciation for the role of sweets in their social life. Whether at a wedding feast or a religious celebration, either way, the existence of these medieval junk food options proves that even in times of hardship, people found ways to sweeten their lives. Now that we've covered some of the sweet snacks of medieval times, let's get into something a little more savory. A big part of medieval junk food wasn't just pastries and fruit. It also came from the world of savory treats. And one of the most popular options, roasted or skewered meat. Picture yourself walking through the streets of a medieval town, the air thick with the smell of sizzling meat, where vendors are hawking hot, juicy cuts of roasted beef, lamb, or even the occasional boar, all impaled on metal rods or spit roasted over an open flame. Meat on the go, whether it was a hunk of roasted chicken or a chunk of lamb on a stick, was the medieval equivalent of grabbing a quick bite. Vendors would roast large cuts of meat throughout the day, keeping the fire stoked so that passers-by could grab a hot portion to snack on, often with little more than a wooden skewer to hold it. It wasn't the fine, carefully plated meals you'd expect at a noble feast. No, this was rustic. Fast food, greasy, smoky, and undeniably satisfying. The fat dripping from the meat would catch the fire's heat, creating an irresistible aroma that drew people in from all over. For the common folk, this wasn't just a luxury. It was a cheap, accessible snack. The act of roasting meat on a stick or over a fire was something that anyone could do, whether at a street stall or at home. No complex recipes, no fancy kitchen equipment, just fire, meat, and a bit of seasoning. This is the kind of food that feels familiar, even in today's world. Simple, no frills, and perfectly satisfying after a long day of hard work. Historians still debate the prevalence of roasted meat in the medieval diet. Some scholars suggest that meat consumption was mostly reserved for the wealthy, while the poor relied on bread, vegetables, and dairy. However, others argue that meat, particularly cheaper cuts or less prized animals like goats or small birds, was more accessible than we might think, after all. Medieval people were creative when it came to cooking, and roasting meat over an open flame was one of the most efficient ways to prepare food. Whether for the rich or poor, roasted meat was one of the quickest, most delicious medieval snacks available. And it's easy to see why it would become such a staple in the street food scene. But what makes this medieval junk food particularly fascinating is the variety of meats available to medieval people, especially during festivals or special occasions. Whole pigs might be roasted, or lambs would be spit roasted for feasts. But these weren't necessarily everyday foods. The average street vendor was likely selling smaller, more accessible cuts, perhaps the leftover bits from larger roasts, turned into quick meals for busy townsfolk. So, whether it was a quick bite of roast mutton or a couple of skewered chicken legs, these meats were far from the elegant roasts we think of today. They were hearty, greasy, and satisfying, perfectly suited for a medieval junk food lover. A quirky detail. Medieval vendors often didn't worry about food presentation. The meat was simply roasted and served, sometimes with a few herbs or salt sprinkled on top. But it wasn't uncommon for vendors to hand over a meat skewer to a customer without much ceremony. Just grab and go. And while the rich might enjoy their roasted meats served with all the trimmings, the street version was much simpler: meat, fire, and a bit of seasoning. In many ways, this meat on a stick became the original fast food. As we continue to explore the world of medieval junk food, let's take a moment to think about the ultimate medieval snack: greasy fish dishes. While fish is often seen today as a healthy meal choice, medieval people didn't always treat it that way. The smell of fried fish, sizzling in a vat of oil or roasted over an open flame, was just as common in medieval markets as the waft of roasted meat. Fish, often salt-preserved or dried, was a key protein source for medieval people. But it could also be found as a greasy street snack, often served on its own or incorporated into stews, pies, or breads. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval marketplace, the air heavy with the smell of salty fish. Stalls line the street, with vendors hawking large, fried fish, served on skewers or wrapped in rough bread. The fish wasn't delicate fillets or finely prepared sushi. It was bony, oily, and hearty. Fish like herring, cod, and even eel were commonly found on the streets, deep fried in animal fat or salted and smoked for preservation. You'd grab a quick bite, perhaps with a few sprigs of parsley to add some freshness, or maybe a squeeze of lemon if you were lucky. These street snacks weren't meant for fine dining. They were quick, filling, and perfect for a snack on the go. Historians still argue whether fish was more of a luxury food in the medieval period or a more common meal for everyday people. In coastal regions, fish was often more accessible and affordable, making it a staple for the lower classes. In more landlocked areas, however, it was typically salted or dried for preservation, making it a more expensive option. What we do know is that fish wasn't just food. It was part of a larger system of eating and preserving that allowed people to survive harsh winters and long stretches without fresh food. A quirky detail. Medieval people didn't always eat their fish in the refined way we might today. In fact, it was common for fish to be eaten whole, with the bones still in place. This wasn't a problem for the medieval folk. They weren't worried about boneless fillets. They were hungry. And the fish offered an easy and accessible meal. The bones, while sometimes a nuisance, were a small price to pay for a filling and affordable snack. Imagine gnawing on a roasted fish with the bones sticking out. Your fingers greasy from the fish oil, but your belly satisfied with the hearty, salty treat. For the wealthy, fish was often served as part of a more refined meal, especially during religious periods when meat was forbidden. Fish was seen as a more pure alternative, and wealthy households might have enjoyed dishes with delicately fried fish fillets, accompanied by sauces and spices. But for the common people, street fish wasn't fancy. It was about getting the job done, satisfying hunger in a quick and affordable way. Fish on the go, medieval style, was no frills, just sustenance. Let's now turn our attention to some of the most decadent and indulgent medieval snacks, enjoyed by the wealthier classes. Medieval street food wasn't just reserved for the working masses. Nobles and royals also had their own version of fast food, but with much more flair and luxury. Think of these medieval treats as the equivalent of modern-day gourmet junk food. While the common folk snacked on simple breads, roasted meats, and fish, the wealthy enjoyed rich, spiced pastries, sugary delicacies, and elaborate dishes that were both extravagant and indulgent. Picture yourself stepping into a lavish banquet hall, where the tables are overflowing with the finest foods. At the center of the feast are beautifully decorated sweet pastries, golden pies filled with rich, spiced meats, sugared tarts, and delicate cakes. These weren't the hearty, rustic pies you might find in a street stall. These were luxurious, crafted with the finest ingredients, often including spices from distant lands. The pies were often filled with exotic meats like venison or swan, layered with sweet dried fruits and spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. These treats were made to impress, both in flavor and presentation. Historians still debate the extent to which the wealthy used street vendors or whether they had access to more elaborate meals prepared at their homes. However, it's clear that for the upper class, food was not just about sustenance, it was about status and spectacle. Large feasts were often held to showcase the host's wealth and generosity, and the food served reflected that. The use of spices, sugar, and even gilded decorations on desserts became a way to show off one's wealth. Sweet pastries, elaborate tarts, and spiced cakes were all part of the luxury junk food available to the medieval nobility. A quirky tidbit. The wealthy also had access to marzipan, a sweet treat made from almonds and sugar that was often shaped into intricate figures or fruits. It was a delicacy that signified the wealth of the person who could afford it. And it wasn't just eaten. It was admired for its beautiful, edible craftsmanship. Imagine biting into a marzipan apple, perfectly shaped and dusted with a bit of gold leaf. It was sweet, artistic, and indulgent. The perfect example of how the rich treated food as more than just a meal, but a work of art. While we're used to seeing sweets as something you eat after a meal, medieval desserts were often enjoyed throughout the feast. They weren't confined to a dessert course, rather, they were an ongoing part of the indulgence that took place during the entire event. These sugary snacks were the medieval equivalent of junk food for the rich. Accessible, yet indulgent, and designed to both satisfy hunger and show off a certain level of refinement. If you were lucky enough to be in the court of a king or noble, you'd have access to these rich foods, which made up the luxurious snack scene of medieval life. While the wealthy indulged in rich pastries and marzipan, the common folk had their own version of luxury snacks, albeit simpler, often born from necessity. When times were hard, or when people simply needed a quick energy boost during a busy day, medieval junk food was a way of getting the calories you needed to power through the work of the day. The simplest forms of this were foods like gruel and porridge. Nothing fancy, but filling. And in many ways, their medieval snacks were more functional than indulgent. These humble foods were a mainstay in the medieval diet, particularly for the lower classes, who didn't have the luxury of choosing from a variety of snacks or indulging in rich dishes. Porridge was the medieval equivalent of a quick, on-the-go meal, made from grains like oats, barley, or rye. Porridge was affordable and easy to prepare. While today, we might think of porridge as something served for breakfast for medieval people, it was a versatile snack that could be eaten at any time of the day. Sometimes it was eaten sweet, with honey or dried fruits mixed in, but often it was savory, with salt and herbs added for flavor. Imagine sitting down with a bowl of warm porridge in the middle of a chilly medieval afternoon, the steam rising from the simple meal, offering sustenance without the need for elaborate preparation. It wasn't the junk food of choice for the rich, but it served as a hearty snack for the common folk. Something that filled the belly and provided energy for long hours of labor. Historians still argue about the role of porridge in the medieval diet. Some suggest that it was primarily a poor person's food, while others argue that it was a simple dish enjoyed by people across all social classes. The reality is likely somewhere in between. For the wealthy, porridge might have been served with more luxurious ingredients, like sweet cream, rich butter, ichthmos, or fine fruits. While for the poor, it was often just a basic, no-frills meal. But no matter the version, it was a snack that brought people together, whether at a humble table or during a feast. And don't forget about gruel, the thin, watery cousin of porridge. Gruel wasn't exactly a snack. It was a meal filler for many medieval peasants, made by boiling grains with water or milk until it became a thin, soupy consistency. It wasn't rich or hearty, but it did the job, providing sustenance when nothing else was available. In fact, gruel was often eaten as a quick meal when there wasn't enough food to go around, making it a low-cost, filling option during lean times. Picture a family gathered around a simple wooden table, dipping their spoons into a pot of gruel to stave off hunger until the next meal could be prepared. A quirky detail about gruel is that it was sometimes flavored with herbs, vegetables, or bits of leftover meat to make it more palatable. Some recipes even added a bit of honey or sugar to sweeten the deal. But this was rare and often reserved for special occasions. While gruel may seem like the least glamorous of medieval snacks, it was undoubtedly one of the most functional, providing much-needed energy and nutrition during tough times. While gruel and porridge may have been filling and functional for the common folk, medieval festivals provided an entirely different experience when it came to snacking. When it was time to celebrate, food was a huge part of the fun, and the medieval festival or feast was the perfect opportunity to indulge in some of the most decadent and sometimes downright bizarre snacks the medieval world had to offer. Picture this. The air is thick with the sounds of music, laughter, and chatter as people gather around long wooden tables, surrounded by the rich smells of roasted meats, spiced pies, bas, and sweet, sugared treats. For the wealthy, this was a time to show off their culinary creativity. For the common folk, it was a chance to enjoy foods that were normally reserved for the upper classes. Medieval festivals were often filled with heavy, hearty meals, but they also had a fair share of snacks that were as indulgent as they were fun. Picture a stall at a festival selling deep-fried pastries, each one crispy and golden, stuffed with meats, cheeses, or fruits. These pastries weren't just about taste. They were about spectacle. Imagine biting into a piping hot, fried pastry filled with spiced lamb or sweet apples, the warm filling oozing out as you take a bite. These snacks were as much about the experience as the flavor, and they were perfect for eating on the go while strolling through the festivities. Historians still argue whether these festival snacks were just about indulgence or whether they served a more practical purpose. Some believe that the rich feasts and snacks were a way to reinforce social status, while others argue that medieval feasts were more about community and celebrating the harvest. Either way, one thing was certain. These festival snacks were a far cry from the everyday foods of the common folk. For a few days at least, people could set aside their gruel and bread and feast like the nobility. These snacks weren't just filling, they were fun and exciting. A true indulgence in the midst of hard, often tedious lives. A quirky tidbit from medieval festivals. Some of the more elaborate food creations were served up with a healthy dose of spectacle. For instance, roasted boar's heads, complete with garnishes of fruits and herbs, were often brought out to show off the wealth of the host. But it wasn't just about the savory. It was the sweet treats that really captured people's attention. Sugared almonds, candied fruits, and honey cakes were enjoyed by all. But the most extravagant of all were the marchpane cakes made from marzipan. These cakes were intricately molded into figures, animals, flowers, even entire scenes from the courtly life, and were often decorated with gold leaf or sugar. Imagine a small, edible sculpture of a knight or a flower, each one made of sweet marzipan, sitting on a table at a festival. These edible works of art were an extravagance, and only the wealthiest could afford them. But their presence at a festival made it feel like a special occasion. Festivals were a time of excess, but not all of it was about the food. The act of snacking at a medieval festival was part of a larger celebration of life, nature, and the abundance of the harvest. Whether it was enjoying a fried pastry with a mug of ale or nibbling on marzipan sculptures, these snacks were designed to make people feel part of something larger, a communal feast where food, music, and conversation flowed freely. As we continue our journey into the medieval world of snacks, let's take a look at how the evolution of sweet treats in medieval times foreshadowed the candy-filled world we know today. While modern confectionery involves a hefty dose of sugar, Medieval sweets were often subtler, crafted from honey, fruit, and spices. But what they lacked in sugar, they made up for in flavor and creativity. Imagine walking through a medieval market at the end of the day, the sun sinking lower, and the air filled with the scents of cinnamon, nutmeg, and baked goods. The snacks on offer aren't the modern candies you'd expect to see at a candy store. Instead, they're intricately crafted and often packed with spiced, fruity fillings that bring an unexpected sweetness to the medieval palate. One of the most fascinating medieval treats was the famous sugar confections made from honey. Medieval people didn't have access to refined sugar in the way we do today, but they used honey to create sweets like honey cakes, sweetened fruit preserves, and even candied fruits. These treats were often flavored with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, which made them rich and aromatic. Picture a small market stall where vendors display their wares, jars of honey, dried fruits, and sweet cakes, all glistening in the soft light of the evening. As you walk past, the smell of cinnamon fills the air, and you catch a glimpse of a honey-caked fig or a date stuffed with spiced almonds, ready for the taking. Historians still debate the role of sweets in the medieval diet. While sugar itself wasn't widespread, honey was used extensively for sweetening both desserts and drinks, and it was one of the most valuable sweeteners of the time. Some historians argue that these sweets were primarily for the wealthy, as honey was costly and often imported from distant lands, while others believe that honey-based treats were enjoyed by common folk as well, especially during festivals or celebrations. Regardless, honey cakes, spiced pastries, and sweet preserves became a treat that was closely tied to medieval life, especially in times of feasts, weddings, or special occasions. A quirky tidbit: medieval people didn't always sweeten their foods the way we do today, with massive amounts of sugar. Instead, they often relied on dried fruits like figs, dates, or raisins, which were naturally sweet. These fruits were sometimes baked into cakes or added to pies, creating a natural sweetness that was complemented by spices. Dried fruits weren't just for eating out of hand. They were used in pastries and pies, acting as both a preservative and a flavoring. The next time you bite into a fruit cake, you're experiencing a taste of medieval indulgence, albeit with a modern twist. And speaking of dried fruits, let's not forget the fruits themselves. Medieval people often preserved their fruits through drying, which allowed them to enjoy sweet treats even in the off-season. They would dry apples, pears, figs, and even grapes, storing them for months. These dried fruits were eaten on their own, but they were also often added to medieval sweets like pastries, pies, or cakes. The dried fruits were naturally sweet and paired perfectly with honey, creating a treat that was both nutritious and satisfying. Imagine sitting down with a medieval snack of dried figs drizzled with honey, the sweetness enhanced by a dusting of cinnamon. For medieval people, sweets weren't just about indulging in sugar. The process of preserving and sweetening with natural ingredients was part of their everyday life. Though their sweet treats weren't as sugary as ours, they were every bit as rich, flavorful, and satisfying, offering a taste of the past that's not so far removed from our modern candy-filled world. Now that we've explored how medieval people satisfied their sweet cravings with honey, dried fruits, and spiced cakes, let's shift gears and dive into how these medieval snacks were preserved. In today's world, we don't often think about how our food will last until the next season. We have refrigerators, freezers, and preservatives to keep things fresh. But in medieval times, food preservation was a matter of survival. And preserving junk food was just as important as ensuring your main meals would last throughout the year. The methods they used to keep their snacks around were creative, sometimes a little gross, but undeniably effective. The primary method of preserving food in the medieval period was drying, for medieval street food like fruit, fish, and even meats. Drying was the go-to option. Dried fruits, like apples, pears, and plums, were often stored in cool, dry places, making them available for snacking long after harvest. You could snack on dried fruit throughout the winter months, and it was often used in pastries or mixed with nuts for a quick, sweet treat. It wasn't quite the modern fruit roll-ups you might find at the store today, but it was the closest thing to an on-the-go snack for medieval folk. Dried fruit, in particular, was often preserved with honey to help retain sweetness and keep it from spoiling. The honey would act as a preservative, sealing in the moisture and making the fruit last longer. Fish, on the other hand, was preserved through salting and smoking, while some medieval street food vendors would roast fish fresh. Others would salt it heavily or smoke it to keep it for longer periods. Salted fish could be sold in markets long after it had been caught, making it a regular part of medieval snack time, especially for those who lived near coastal regions. The salt helped preserve the fish, but it also gave it a distinctive flavor that medieval folk loved. This wasn't the delicate, lightly salted fish you might find in modern cuisine. It was robust and salty, with a taste that lingers long after the meal is over. It wasn't always the most pleasant to eat. Think about the lingering saltiness. But it was an important part of the diet for many medieval people. Meat preservation was similarly creative. While fresh meat was often consumed at feasts, smaller cuts of meat or less desirable parts of the animal were salted, dried, or smoked to be used later. These preserved meats were not only stored for winter months when fresh meat was harder to come by, but they also found their way into medieval snacks. For example, salted meats like dried sausage or jerky could be eaten alone as a quick, filling snack or thrown into a bread roll or pie to create an easy meal. In times when food was scarce, this preserved meat might be the only option for a quick snack, and it kept people going when fresh food wasn't available. Historians still debate the true extent of meat preservation methods in medieval times. Some argue that preserved meat was a luxury, a sign of wealth, while others suggest it was a more everyday food for people of all social classes. It seems likely that meat preservation methods, particularly salting and drying, were not just for the rich, but for anyone who needed to ensure they had food available during the leaner months of the year. Whether the meat was enjoyed fresh at a feast or preserved for later use, it was an essential part of the medieval food landscape. A quirky fact: the medieval method of drying meat didn't just involve the common cuts. It's rumored that certain parts of the animal, like the feet, ears, and tail, were preserved in the same way. Though these cuts were often considered less desirable by modern standards, these parts weren't just thrown away, they were put to use, creating a resourceful, albeit unappealing, snack for those in need. As we near the end of our explorations into the fascinating world of medieval junk food, let's take a step back and reflect on how these foods were more than just a way to satisfy hunger. Medieval snacks were deeply tied to the rhythms of the day, the seasons, and the social fabric of medieval life. They were not just about filling your belly. They were also about community, practicality, and sometimes a little indulgence. Food in the medieval world was an experience, and medieval junk food was a unique blend of necessity and luxury, social connection and individual sustenance. The medieval snack scene was shaped by what people could afford, where they lived, and what was available in their region. For the rich, Snack time meant indulging in decadent pies, spiced pastries, honey cakes, and wine, all accompanied by the social spectacle of grand feasts. For the poor, medieval snacks were more about survival. Cheap and practical foods like bread, cheese, roasted meats, and salted fish. These snacks could be eaten on the go, keeping people energized through long hours of work or travel. But even for the working class, there was room for a little indulgence. After all, festivals and celebrations allowed people from all walks of life to enjoy the pleasures of rich, hearty street food, like fried pastries, spiced meats, and roasted fruit. What's truly fascinating is how medieval snacks gave rise to some of the basic principles of modern junk food. Just as we grab a fast food burger today, medieval folk would grab a quick meat pie, a hunk of cheese, or a steaming mug of ale on the go. These foods were portable, convenient, and often satisfying in ways we can still understand today. Sure, they didn't come in plastic wrappers, but the concept of quick, accessible food that could be consumed on the run has been with us for centuries. But let's not forget the role of preservation. While we have refrigerators and freezers to keep our food fresh, medieval people relied on drying, salting, smoking, and pickling to make sure their snacks could last. Whether it was dried fruits, salted fish, or smoked meats. These preservation methods allowed medieval people to enjoy their favorite snacks throughout the year, no matter the season. And while some of these methods might seem unappetizing today, dried fish or salted meats, they were a crucial part of life for people who didn't have the luxury of modern food storage. And perhaps, most importantly, medieval junk food was about the experience of eating. Whether you were savoring a honey cake at a feast or grabbing a roasted meat skewer at the market, food was a social experience. Eating wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about sharing, connecting, and indulging in the moment. In many ways, medieval people's approach to food, even the junk food, was no different than ours today. They enjoyed their snacks with friends, shared them at festivals, and used them to fuel their work. The only difference, they didn't have the luxury of refined sugars, processed snacks, or the fast food chains we have now. But in a way, medieval junk food paved the way for the snacking culture we have today. So, next time you reach for that quick snack, take a moment to appreciate how it connects you to the past. Whether it's a bag of chips or a candy bar, modern junk food shares its origins with the medieval snacks that once kept people going through long workdays, feasts, and festivals. And while the ingredients may have changed over the centuries, the joy of snacking remains a timeless pleasure. Word count, 1063.